Hello, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. Welcome to Connect Africa. So, tonight's conversation is not really about the whole Venezuela. It's about power, who has it, who exercises it, and who lives at its mercy. So, reports and discussions around the alleged pursuit of Venezuela's president by the United States, framed through drugs and criminality, raise deeper questions that go far beyond one man or one country. They face they force us to confront an uncomfortable reality that in today's world, sovereignty is not always a guarantee. It's often conditional. Some leaders are sanctioned, indicted, or pursued across borders. Others, despite war, civilian bases or destabilization campaigns remain untouchable. The difference is not morality, it's power. For Africa, this matters profoundly. From sanctions and aid conditionalities to regime change and security partnerships, our continent has long been shaped by external decisions made in distant capitals. And as new Africa leaders openly challenge imperial influence, whether in the Sahel, Central Africa, or beyond, we must ask ourselves what are the real costs of defiance in a world where law, finance, and force increasingly blur. Tonight, we are joined by investigative journalist and author David Hundeyin to examine what this moment tells us about global justice, African vulnerability, and the future of sovereignty itself. David, welcome to Connect Africa once again.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and so let's set the frame. It's all about power, not personality. So let's first start. Let's aside Maduro, the individual, for a moment. And what does it mean for the global order when one country claims the right to arrest or abduct a sitting president of another sovereign state?
So I think there was a video which I remember watching this sometime last year. It was an excerpt from a podcast appearance by the American economist Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, where he explained the rationale behind this kind of behavior and why a nation state like the US does things like this and what the ultimate goal is. He described U.S. foreign policy as
David, sorry, before you are like frozen, but we hear your voice. Is that?
Can you hear me?
We do hear you, but your image is like frozen.
Oh, that's strange. Is it still frozen?
Yeah, and myself too now. Wow. Okay.
Okay, you're not frozen on my screen. I can see you moving and everything, and I'm not frozen on my screen either. So maybe it's
okay. All right. Let's hope this will get anyway. I hear you. Okay.
Okay, so I was saying there was something that I saw Dr. Jeffrey Sachs say, which resonated very deeply, which I think explains what we're witnessing. He described the animating philosophy behind U.S. foreign policy as a game of risk. Now, if you've ever played the board game Risk, you know that it's all about bluffing and overplaying your hand and hoping that the opponent doesn't realize that you're bluffing. And basically, if you bluff and your bluff isn't called, then you win, basically. He said, so essentially, while countries like China and Russia have fairly conservative, cautious foreign policy where decisions are only taken after like extensive reviews and things have to go through layers and layers and layers of controls, that in the US, as the world's foremost imperial power, they have a different approach to running an empire, that they play a game of risk. that how they play the game of risk is they try things. So, for example, they decide after telling Russia at the fall of the Soviet Union that NATO is not going to expand 1 inch eastward. That was a guarantee, a cast iron signed guarantee that was given to the Russians in the early 1990s. And then next thing you know, all your Georgias and Estonias and all these sort of border countries surrounding Russia start getting absorbed one by one into the EU and NATO. So not 1 inch eastward becomes 500 kilometers eastward. And each time they're betting on Russia not reacting each time. It's a game of risk. Right. So what you do in a game of risk is two things. You give your opponent something to lose, and then you push and prod and hope that based on your opponent's thinking that maybe there's too much for me to lose if I respond here, that they're not going to respond. So that's what they did in the 1990s with Russia, because I think that's the most recent example before this, where they essentially sort of supposedly absorbed Russia into the Western order, certainly into the Western financial system, into the Western consumer system, and made it um, sort of what's the word I'm looking for? They made it uh, an unpleasant course of action from a Russian point of view to want to assert its own sovereignty, because by doing that, then you risk sanctions and then you risk cutting yourself out of this fantastic consumer economy that you plugged yourself into. And they just keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, and there's no response from the other side, and there's no response, and there's no response, and there's no response until they've basically reached the end of the board and they've won, right? That's risk. That's what they did in the 1990s, and I think that's exactly what they're doing now. I think Dr. Sachs was spot on with that assessment. That's exactly what we're witnessing. They have essentially taken an almighty gamble that at a time when everybody and their dog knows that the rise of multipolarity is signaling the end of the US empire, it's very, very obvious. Everybody talks about it openly. It's no longer something that is spoken about on like niche podcasts or whatever, or conspiracy forums. It's now something that's discussed openly. They know that the death of an empire is heavily accelerated by when people no longer believe in the power of that empire, when people sort of see through the smoke and the mirrors and realize that these guys are not all that. So they have taken a gamble that to reinforce that image of invincibility, at least temporarily, that what could be a better thing to do than take on one of these sort of long time foes that has been like a thorn in the flesh for them for a long time, and do it in such a visually spectacular manner that the whole world is completely taken aback. Nobody saw it coming, and nobody really knows how to react to it. And that's the goal of this, because that reinforces that illusion once again that these guys are 50 steps ahead. You can't fight them. They know everything. They're all powerful. Meanwhile, all they really did was find a way to penetrate the Venezuelan security system. Because I think it's fair to say that a bunch of helicopters flying from offshore into Venezuela without any sort of air defense engagement and being able to capture the actual sitting head of state of a sovereign country, that's not possible except there's internal collusion. I think it's fair to say. So what they really found a way to do was compromise elements within Venezuela. And then if the goal was really maybe to stage an invasion of Venezuela and start a war which you and I know wouldn't go well for them, they would have done that. But they know, they've done their calculations, and they know that wouldn't have gone well at all. The public in the US has no appetite for American boots on the ground in yet another, engineered conflict. They know that, and they also know that the actual mechanics of winning a war in Venezuela is next to impossible. The topography, the terrain, and then the level of preparedness by the population, which is also armed, they know it wouldn't go well. It just wouldn't work. They've done the math. So what can we do now that this conventional warfare route isn't going to give us the win that we're looking for. Okay, we can do it this way. This is also visually spectacular, right? So we go in and stage this supposed surgical strike, basically a decapitation strike, and kidnap a sitting head of state, and then make sure that we blast pictures of him in handcuffs all over the internet. The reason for making sure that all that those visuals were so widely promoted wasn't necessarily to prove a point to Venezuela. It was for our benefit. It's for all of us to look, this is the power that the empire has. So if you are also in opposition to this empire, if it could happen to Maduro, it can happen to you. That's what the goal of all this is. It's what conventionally you would describe as terrorism. That's what it is, because the goal of terrorism is to create a psychological reaction, right? So it's basically terrorism. That's what it is, right? And they've done so, I think, very successfully. It has had the desired effect to a very large extent. To the best of my knowledge, only 3 countries in Africa have actually expressed any kind of solid position stating that this is unacceptable, this shouldn't happen, we protest against this. So, to the best of my knowledge, it's Ghana, South Africa, and I think Namibia that have actually done that. Everyone else, including Nigeria, where I come from, obviously, radio silence. The African Union put out a very disgraceful statement which said everything and nothing at all. When something that is so unambiguously monstrous happens, and then you put out a statement sitting on the fence, that means you've taken the side of the perpetrator. That means you've accepted that even though this is wrong, I am so completely defeated and powerless and hopeless that I have surrendered to the power of this perpetrator. So I'm not going to condemn what Stevie Wonder can see is wrong. Right. So I think that's what the Americans were trying to accomplish with this. And I think we're now entering an age in global geopolitics where we're not this. I don't think this is the last time we've seen something like this, where this kind of warfare is going to become more of a norm, where the goal is not necessarily to destroy military targets or to eliminate an army, or to hold on to territory or something, but that the goal is simply to do something visually spectacular and then use those visuals to terrorize the rest of the planet and create this visceral psychological reaction in people. So it's a form of psychological warfare, and I think that's what we're going to be seeing a lot more of.
This is state terrorism, huh? My goodness. I said this is state terrorism, like
that's exactly what it is. State terrorism
in a legitimate way, making it kind of just to add a note, okay, South Africa, Ghana, Namibia, I haven't come across. Okay, good, but also Burkina Faso and Mali, they did not issue a statement, but they have talked with the foreign minister of Venezuela, and he posted it on X. That's
right.
So wow. Let's move to their selective criminality now. Why is it that leaders from the global south can be criminalized internationally, while Western leaders responsible for wars, coups, or mass civilian deaths are never subjected to the same treatment? Is it our failure not to do so, or what?
It's a power imbalance. It's as simple as that. What we know as international law, the entire infrastructure of the post-World War II planet as we know it, is an infrastructure that was put together for the benefit of those who were in power at the end of the war. Let's be under no illusions about that. The purpose of international law was never to deliver justice to people, to Africans. That was never the goal of international law as we know it. The goal was to maintain a certain social, political, and economic order with a certain group of people at the top and a certain group of people under them. That was always the goal. That is why be it the ICC or the ICJ or the UN and all these other bodies and parastatal, supranational institutions, all of these things, none of them has ever been able to use their teeth against a significant Western actor. It has never happened. You've never seen, I mean, the closest that they've come to that was when the ICC issued an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, which I think that arrest warrant is nearly 2 years old now. It's never been honored, and the man still travels all over the world freely. Nothing happened to him. And then the ICC judges who issued the warrant all got sanctioned. Right, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, doesn't have access to a bank account right now as we're speaking because of US sanctions. Right? He's not even a US citizen or a US resident. He's a British citizen, but because of US sanctions, banks in Britain will not do business with him. He's not allowed to have a life in any conventional way that you're familiar with. It's not allowed. He can't use a Netflix account. He can't use an Uber. He can't, think of any random thing he can do. He can't make a purchase with his card because Visa and MasterCard are subject to US sanctions. And all that is happening to him because he was responsible for issuing an arrest warrant against the Western war criminal, Benjamin Milikowski, aka Netanyahu. Right? So that's the reality of the world that we live in. There's a very famous quote from a Nigerian acquaintance of mine, Doye Alfred. He said, slavery was legal, colonialism was legal. Legality is a construct of power, not justice. Right? And I think it's very important for us to always remember this. So when things like this happen, we're not sort of taken aback or caught flat-footed. We should kind of expect this to happen. That this is how the world, in fact, has always functioned, and for whatever reason, we just seem to be noticing it now.
Let's dwell on this criminality thing and the narratives that they have created around it. It's not about drugs, is it? Like, are we witnessing the use of criminal law as a modern instrument of regime change, like replacing the older ones, more visible forms of intervention?
No, I think that would be overthinking it. I think even they don't really expect you to believe that this is about drugs or about drug cartels. Nobody believes it. They don't believe it. They don't really expect you to believe it. As I said, the goal of this is to basically send a psychological message to you. It's psychological terrorism, right? It's state terrorism. The goal is to show that resistance is futile. Right. So whoever you are, you think you are in resistance to the empire, you speak up loudly, you have a voice, you organize boycotts, you do political organizing, you speak out very strongly, you have a social media following, you write, you speak, whatever it is that you do. Here we have a whole head of state and we picked him up like a rag doll and put him in handcuffs and yanked him off to jail in our country. So if you can do that to a heavily protected head of state, the head of state sitting on top of the world's largest oil reserves. Venezuela is not a poor country. So if you can do that to him, imagine what we can do to you.
Yeah.
That's what the goal of this is. So they don't really expect you to think that this is about some cartel de los soles, which doesn't actually exist. They know, as well as you know, that is all bullshit. The goal of this was to terrorize you. And unfortunately, I think it's working for many people. I guess the thing about invoking this non-existent drug accusation and to use that as a narrative justification isn't so much about the justification in itself. You and I know it's not a justification. They know it's not a justification. But the goal is, again, it's part of that sort of psychological terror that this group of people can wake up tomorrow and cook up any kind of nonsense. Right? They can accuse you of I don't know, committing an ant genocide, killing an ant farm or something, and turn that into an excuse to yank you off to jail on another continent. Because if they could literally create this whole edifice of bullshit out of nothing, right? They literally created this narrative that there is this non-existent drug cartel called the Cartel de los Soles, which is supposedly led by Nicolas Maduro. Nicolas Maduro was or is the president of the country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves. Why on earth would the person sitting on the world's largest oil reserves need to have any involvement whatsoever in drugs? Is it money that's his problem? Sitting on the world's largest oil reserves? Are you being serious? So, of course, they know that this is all nonsense and they don't expect you to believe it. But they expect you to be terrified at the implication that someone can create a mountain of bullshit, wake up on the wrong side of the bed, create this mountain of nonsense and use it, no matter how fatuous a justification it is, and no matter how tenuous and just non-credible and not believable, and use it as a justification to just basically turn your life upside down and do so in a very public and very humiliating manner. And you're supposed to be terrified.
It's yeah, absolutely. It seems that it's like a consented arrangement that this domestic US law is now being enforced globally as if it is arranged. Now, if that is so, then this powerful state, the fact that the powerful state can unilaterally criminalize and pursue foreign leaders, what stops this from becoming a standard practice?
Nothing. Nothing stops it. However, the caveat to that is, I don't think that they expect to get away with this a second time. I think, again, it all boils down to the psychological impact of this that they expect it to have. This is all a game of risk for them. And let's also be clear about something. If they were all powerful, you wouldn't have any doubt in your mind. You would know because they would show it. So the fact that there's any doubt at all about their supposed, invincibility is in and of itself proof that they are not invincible. This is all a game of risk. The purpose of the game of risk is to present, say you have a stack of cards which add up to 9, right? The purpose of risk is to present them in such a way that your opponent believes that they are 90 instead of 9. That's the purpose of a game of risk. You're setting yourself up to look a lot more formidable than you actually are, and then you bank on the fear or the caution of your opponent to keep them from bursting your bubble. That's the purpose of the game of risk. And if you do that successfully enough, you essentially help your opponent to defeat themselves, right? Because you don't actually have anything, but you're just using psychology against them. That's what risk is. I think that's exactly what they're doing here. So they don't expect that this is something that they can repeat ad infinitum. If it was, they would have already done it. If it was in their power, if it were in their power, it's not just Nicolas Maduro that would have happened to. It would have happened to Nicolas Maduro. It would have happened to the Cuban head of state. It would have happened to the Colombian head of state. There'd be like 6 heads of state who would be like, if they really had that power, that's what would have happened. Right? They don't, and they're not going to. They're not going to be. Well, they weren't lucky. This was a very well planned operation, but lightning is not going to strike twice in the same place. However, they don't expect you to know that. Again, it's that psychological implication that they're planting in your mind. If this could happen to Maduro, who says it can't happen to me? And therefore, as a result, I'm going to pipe down. I'm going to become subservient. I'm going to shut up. I'm going to do what I'm told by the empire, because this empire that I thought was dying and on its way down clearly still has this, incredible amount of power. And, I misjudged them by thinking that they're becoming weaker. That's what the purpose of this is. So on paper, yes, they absolutely can get away with this. On paper, in practice, not so much, right? There are certain cards that you play and there are certain buttons you push. You can only push once. And once you've pushed it, which is again, it's kind of like how the game of risk is played. There are certain moves you make you can't repeat. So you just have to hope that once you make this move, once you play this Hail Mary, this Joker card, you have to hope that your opponent takes the bait. Now, if your opponent does not take the bait, and if your opponent actually insists on bursting your bubble or calling your bluff, then you are completely screwed. So that's kind of where we are right now. We're not sure how the rest of the world is going to respond to this, particularly Africa, because we're
Yeah.
speaking from an African point of view.
Yeah. So that
The
brings me to my next question. So
right,
many African states are obviously weaker institutionally than Venezuela, at
yeah.
least it's fair to say. If this can happen there, as you said, it can definitely happen in Africa. So why shouldn't the African leaders, or I mean, leader is a heavy word, or heads of states, past or present, see this as a warning and do something about it? As we speak, 99% are just silent.
So they would do that if they were, I guess, if they had ambitions of sovereignty or if they saw themselves as sovereign. Not many African leaders or heads of states, we can't really call them leaders, they're not leading anything, but
Yeah.
heads of states, not many African heads of states actually think of themselves as heads of states. They think of themselves as almost middle management because somebody put them there. So the few who see themselves as sovereign, those are the few who we've already spoken about, who they've actually spoken out or they've put out some sort of communication that has showed very well that they see themselves as sovereign leaders of sovereign countries. Um, but for the most part, that's just not the case. So it kind of falls down to people like us who come from countries that, that may be led by some of these characters to try and, through platforms like this, to try and speak directly to the generality of people and make people understand that whether or not your head of state thinks of himself as sovereign or not, you are allowed to be sovereign, right? Your country is allowed to be sovereign. The fact that a foreign entity placed a puppet head of state at the head of your government doesn't mean that you have to be a puppet.
Lemfi. Download today and get started.
You can be sovereign, right? You can assert some measure of sovereignty, at the very least, through some sort of opposition to this, ongoing order. So that's kind of where we are right now. So no, you're probably not going to get much of the kind of reaction that you're looking for from the current African heads of state that exist. In fact, you're probably if it were down to the likes of Bola Tinubu and William Ruto and Patrice Talon and the usual suspects, you would probably even hear congratulations. Congratulations to the US for taking down a dictator or some other nonsense like that. That's the kind of thing you'd probably hear from them. I mean, you've seen Bobby Wine today, who's not even a head of state yet. He's just an opposition candidate in Uganda, but he's already basically cheerleading and saying, as you're celebrating the ouster of a dictator, don't forget us and you get blah, blah, blah. So it's clear. I mean, we know what constituency Bobby Wine represents. We know who is behind him.
Yeah.
We know exactly what he's about.
And
So
we
that's
know
not a
where he's
surprise.
traveling, who he's meeting. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's not a surprise. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if in the coming few days we're actually going to get more of those kinds of reactions from actual sitting heads of states, even in the face of public condemnation or dismay from. It's not the people who put them there.
Just to add on that one, by the way, Somaliland, before even becoming a state, has congratulated and shown their support to what US has done against Venezuela.
Shock, gasp.
Oh my God.
Imagine my surprise.
Now let's go to Burkina Faso and Captain Ibrahim Traore and take this as a live case study. Okay, so
Yeah.
President Ibrahim Traore has openly positioned himself against imperial influence and foreign military control or presence. Now, in a global system that now we are describing or talking about, what would stop a similar narrative like this drug terrorism, criminality, or whatever from being constructed around leaders like him?
On paper, nothing. And I think they've already started trying to construct similar straw men, I think they're called. I haven't confirmed the story, but someone sent me a story earlier today about something about a an airplane filled with cocaine that supposedly was meant to have originated from Burkina Faso or something like that. So I think
Wow,
someone again,
really?
I've not verified that story. It's a story that I heard from a colleague of mine who is actually from Burkina Faso, but it's not been verified yet. But apparently, at least based on that rumor, it would seem that someone is trying to fly that kite. Again, I don't really think necessarily that the expectation is that they're going to come in and repeat the same trick again. I think the purpose of putting stories like that in the public domain, again, is part of that psychological terrorism effort to create fear in the minds of people that, hey, is the same thing that was done to Maduro, is that same thing being planned for Ibrahim Traore? So
Mhm.
it could be that that story isn't actually a story that is being reported, but it's just like a WhatsApp rumor that is being promoted. But then again, if you draw the line back far enough, where did that WhatsApp rumor come from? Who put it out there? Right? There are all sorts of shadowy BTL actors who are linked to the state that do things like that, right? To create, fear, uncertainty, and doubt in foreign populations. It's not a secret. I've been in rooms where things like this have been discussed. Back when I used to work in marketing, this which is like over a decade ago, I was in some of these rooms where these things were discussed. So if these things were being done in Africa over a decade ago, of course they're being done in Washington and in Tel Aviv now in 2026. So again, I think ultimately the goal of all this is that psychological inference that you are not safe, right? You might think that you live in a sovereign country. You might think you have the protection of a sovereign government. You might think you are not subject to the empire and it's nonsense, but the empire can get you wherever you are. I think that's the goal, the primary goal of this Maduro stunt that they pulled, because what else have they actually got out of it, objectively speaking? I know there's been a lot of talk about how supposedly the US is running Venezuela right now. Is there any evidence of that? I haven't seen any. So as far as I can tell, some sort of deal was struck within Maduro's circle and within the Venezuelan security forces to give the empire this visually spectacular win, because the goal in and of itself was this visually spectacular event. Maduro, what may or may not happen to him going forward is completely immaterial. The goal of all of this was to get that picture of him in handcuffs and then blast it around the world with their media machine, which they've done. So that in and of itself then creates this psychological terror effect, not just among populations, but among leaders of countries that have ambitions of being sovereign, but maybe are not nuclear powers yet. Right? And this is not just me, putting forward a theory. If you remember a guy called Jean Aristide, the former president of Haiti,
Oh, okay.
he said something similar. So he was quite literally psychologically tortured while he was in office, while he was in power. The Americans literally um, placed him in a state of constant fear, visceral fear for his life. And he was, as I recall, he was physically abducted from Haiti while a sitting head of state. So this is actually not the first time that the US
Yeah.
has done something like this. This is the first time that people have been aware of it, but it's not the first time this has been done. right? Something like this was also done in 1989 in Panama,
Yeah, that's true.
also for similar reasons, right? It wasn't necessarily because, this is something that they can just do and get away with, but at that moment in time, it was a point that they needed to make. So it's a similar thing, and the same thing was done with Aristide in Haiti. Now it's been done with Maduro. So and there was roughly 15 years between each of these events. So maybe roughly every 15 years is when something like this happens. So maybe when 2026 now, maybe it's in 2040 or 2041. If the empire still exists in its current form, then that's when we'll be seeing something like this happen again.
Yeah, that's a good observation. True. I think I heard it also from my friend from Kwame. Yeah, there's such a calculation every certain years that things happen. Now, there's something that really that I'm uncomfortable with. Most of the time, these African heads of states, the reason that they give for not condemning something when they see when the West does it is that they hide under this principle of non-alliance. Okay,
Right.
but when they do that, for example, for things like this, it's a loud, actually a very loud alliance with the United States, not saying anything at this time, right?
Yeah.
So now, with that being said, let's talk about this sovereignty or if it is illusion, given how dependent many African countries are, through Western security cooperation, aid, financial system, whatnot. Is African sovereignty, is it reality or is it something symbolic as we speak?
It's somewhere in between. So, in some senses, especially in countries that have made an effort to build their local technical and technological base, there is some measure of sovereignty in some parts of Africa. However, it's also fair to say that across the majority of the continent, sovereignty is very much notional. It's very symbolic because um, in, say, Nigeria, for example, now that this new so-called tax bill has come into power, it came into power on the 1st of January 2026, and France, or entities that are controlled by foreign government, France now have direct oversight and supervision of Nigeria's entire financial system. There's now a situation where the primary method for carrying out electronic transactions in Nigeria, which is bank transfers, are now under the purview of a foreign government. In a country like Ghana, the primary method for electronic transactions is mobile money, which is under the purview of MTN and Airtel and whatnot, but which technically are foreign companies, but the local entities are locally owned and they're regulated by the Bank of Ghana. Right, so there is a measure of sovereignty there. But in Nigeria, you have the entire Nigerian financial system being overseen by France, and then the primary method for moving money within that system is basically subject to what the French decide. So basically, there's no meaningful sovereignty there. Because if you're not carrying out a bank transfer which is visible to France, then you're using your Visa or your MasterCard, which is subject to US sanctions. You're not sovereign. If you don't have the basic ability to move money around in your economy without Western say so, you're not sovereign. Right? Because money is basically the most important thing in an economy after food. Right? So if you don't have the capacity to circulate money in your economy without Western permission, you are not sovereign. So Nigeria is not sovereign, not by any means. Countries like Ghana, they have some measure of sovereignty. I wouldn't go as far as to say that they have full financial sovereignty. They don't, but they have some measure of sovereignty. At least theoretically, they have the capacity to run their systems independent of foreign permission, which is a good thing. Countries like Kenya, something similar, they have some measure of potential sovereignty. However, there's a lot of complication because by virtue of who is in power and all these many neo-colonial deals that have been signed, you know where I'm going with this. So it's a mixed bag, to be honest. Africa is a very confusing place like that because if you follow any of the popular narratives are all wrong. Let's be clear about that. So there are some popular narratives that state that Africa is as hopeless, it's a basket case, everything, absolutely everything is foreign controlled. Africans have no power. That's not true.
Okay.
There's a significant amount of things that are locally owned and locally controlled. There's a significant local technology base. However, there's this constant back and forth, this constant war, unspoken and unseen war between local African innovation and ownership and control and foreign control. And the problem is that a lot of the people who are involved in that war don't understand what they're fighting. And I know this because I've met many of them, I've spoken to them, and they do not understand that what they're up against, the machine they're up against, is not a greedy American investor, it's not a greedy American venture capitalist, that it's a colonial monster that they're up against. It's imperialism that they're up against. They do not understand that. So they, instead of aggregating their efforts and fighting as one, which is really the only shot they have at winning, everyone is fighting his own little silo. So in the tech industry, I've met loads of these people. So people who come up with, financial tech solutions or other tech solutions within their country's space long before any Western person ever came up with it. And they've been trying to push it, and they don't realize that what they're doing is building sovereignty for their country. They don't think of it as that. They just think that they're trying to do business and gain a foothold in a virgin space. And then some white guy from New York or wherever just flies in and basically just takes over the whole thing, maybe buys into their company, and they're supposed to be partners. And then the white guy still carries out a boardroom coup. And before you know it, the person who created the whole thing is out on his arse somewhere, and the white guy is now in control. And then the whole thing gets rebranded and it becomes an American thing. And then the person who was kicked out then reaches out to me to tell their story. And they think that the story that I'm supposed to tell is a story about how a greedy investor from San Francisco stole their company from them. And they don't realize that the story is actually how an agent of imperialism has done what imperialists do, because they don't understand that imperialism is not necessarily about guns and political statements. The imperialism is also about investors and scientists and coders. That imperialism literally shows up everywhere. If you start talking about these things, they call you a communist, and they don't, because they just don't understand the way the world works at all. They don't understand what they're at war with. They don't understand that they're even at war at all. So that's what makes the picture very complicated. So Africa has the potential to have a lot more sovereignty than it currently has, because there is a lot of capacity on the continent. Regardless of whatever popular narrative that exists, that Africans don't have certain skills, or they're badly educated, or colonial education creates wrong results, they're educated for the wrong things. A lot of that is true, but it's not entirely true. There's a very significant concentration of the right kind of education and right kind of skills across many parts of the continent, but they never aggregate and they never work together because they don't understand what they're up against. They don't understand that they're at war with an imperial monster. They really don't get it. They think that there is a free market and the world is a global village, and that all you need to do is compete, and the gods of capitalism shall bestow wealth and favor unto you. You and I know that's not how that works at all. Yeah. But they don't. So
I don't know if I asked this directly. What is the impact of what happened now, this aggression or invasion of the United States against Venezuela, if we translate that to Africa and to our current, situation? How does it impact us?
Well, the first thing obviously is that a chilling effect has been created. A strengthening of that culture of fear has been achieved by this, right? This game of risk that the US government is playing is achieving that result. It's creating psychological terror on the African continent. It's doing that very well. I've been seeing the reactions to it. It absolutely is doing that. So that's the first thing. That's the first effect that it's having. It's demoralizing people. The second potential effect that this has, again, this is entirely hypothetical. We're not seeing any evidence of this, but a hypothetical effect of this is that in the event that the empire then decides, maybe in its dying days, in its, in the throes of death, to throw all its toys out of the pram and to just go completely nuclear at everything and everyone and basically just make a huge mess, lash out at everyone. On paper, it is possible that a lot of Africa could be very, very, very badly destabilized. And I'll explain what I mean. In 1994, I think it was, when the genocide broke out in Rwanda and in Burundi, what kicked it off was a single plane crash carrying two presidents. Just one plane crash, and close to 1 million people died in 3 months. And then that led to the first Congo War, which then led to the second Congo War, which still spills over to today's crisis in the DRC. So who knows how many millions of people have died over the past 30 years because a plane crashed. Now, in the event that this empire decides to go completely cuckoo, how many planes could it cause to crash with important people on it? How many Maduro type of events, hypothetically, could it stage that could lead to very vast amounts of destabilization, right? If, say, for the sake of argument, a 1994 type of scenario were to play out where important people are assassinated, and say a local actor is successfully framed as being responsible for this, and then as a result, a civil war breaks out and whatnot. Meanwhile, it's actually the US government behind it, which is not something that is beyond them. That's a scenario worth being worried about. I think from an African sovereignist point of view, or let me say from an AES point of view, because I think the AES currently is the only part of Africa which has real ambitions of sovereignty and which is actually working towards sovereignty. From an AES point of view, I absolutely would be worried. I'd be worried because this demonstrates that the weakness, the most concerning weakness that is inherent in anti-imperialist structures is not necessarily military weakness. Venezuela is not militarily weak, not by any means.
No.
Right? They have a lot of military capacity. They purchase arms from Russia and from China. They're modern military, right? But clearly the weakness is not military hardware and military doctrine and discipline and whatnot, or manpower or arms. The real weakness is human ideology. People can be turned, right? People can be turned into traitors, because that's clearly what happened here. You don't gain access to a sitting president of Tuvalu without someone in his circle having made that possible.
Yeah.
Much less a country like Venezuela, which again I have to stress is not some weak, poor backwater country, not by any means. So the only way that this happened was that there was large scale, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a particular term, there's a military term for it, but basically like there were fifth columnists within the ranks that Maduro had around him. So from an AES point of view, I'd be very worried, especially given that almost simultaneously while all this was happening, we then heard that there was an attempted coup in Burkina Faso.
Yeah.
And the method that this coup attempted to use was strikingly similar to the method that was used to get hold of Maduro, where it's not so much like fire and fury and all, visually spectacular attack. It's more of like something that has been planned using a few strategically positioned traitors within the power structure to open certain pathways and to create certain avenues for certain things to pass through, ultimately with the goal of disabling certain security infrastructure so that you can get hold of the person in charge. Now, the people were able to resist it this time around, but, and, full marks to the people of Burkina Faso for that, by the way. They, all how many million of them live in Burkina Faso? They're all my heroes. However, having said that, a command structure has to be a command structure. You can't always rely on mass revolutionary action to protect, a revolutionary figure. There needs to be total ideological alignment within the ranks of the AES militaries, right? It needs to be part, the ideological aspects of the AES needs to become a foundational part of the military doctrine of the AES. I think there are too many people in the AES militaries who were already there before the AES existed, who became soldiers because it was the job that was available, and not necessarily because they wanted to defend and protect their countries, or they understood the importance of defending or protecting their countries, or that they cared at all. I think there are a lot of people within those structures who are just, for them, it's just a job and they're just taking orders, right? And they don't necessarily understand the enormity of what they are tasked with. I think I'm not advocating for like a large scale dramatic military purge. I'm not advocating for that because that can create instability, and that in and of itself can be exploited in certain ways. I'm not advocating for that. But I think that whether we like it or not, the ranks of the militaries across all the three AES countries need to be, maybe not one large visually spectacular process, but as an ongoing process, there needs to be like regular, shall we say, purifying or refinement of those ranks, right? Whether we like it or not, you cannot have people who have access, for example, to the president, or people who have the capacity to influence the outcome of something like a coup d'etat. And those people are people who are not ideologically in lockstep with the AES. The Chinese model here is very instructive. The Chinese Communist Party is very unapologetic about the fact that it expects to have full, total, and unconditional control of the Chinese state. They are very unapologetic about it. Before you can become anything in China's public service, in China's military, you need to pass through the indoctrination of the Chinese Communist Party. It's just the law. It's just how it is, right? So if you want to become a local councillor in China, you need to join the Chinese Communist Party as a student in school. You need to pass through the ranks. You need to display your loyalty and prove it. You need to be vetted. Then there will be an intra-party election and a selection process after that to ensure that anyone who has any sort of ideological non-alignment or who cannot be relied on, that person gets tossed out somewhere within those recruitment stages, right? So the people who get to be in power in China are people who are fully 100% committed to the Chinese Communist Party's project. That is the project that has raised that has been the most successful poverty alleviation program in known human history. That's taken close to 1 billion people out of poverty in just 40 years, right? And that was only possible because of total unconditional discipline. I feel like the AES still doesn't have that total unconditional discipline yet. And obviously that's not their fault. It's barely 3 years old. Obviously, it's a lot to ask for a 2.5-year-old organization to have the structures that an organization that is close to a century old has. That's the Chinese Communist Party. However, they can borrow some of the principles that are used by the Chinese Communist Party, right? Whether or not you believe in communism is completely beside the point. The point is, this is an anti-imperialist project that has been in my opinion, the most successful anti-imperialism project in the entire 20th and 21st century is China, in my opinion. So what have they done right? The number one thing that they've got right is total and unconditional loyalty and discipline, right? There is no within the party, maybe there's dissent, there are discussions back and forth, there are disagreements, but within the state, such things do not exist, right? So there's a place for politics, there's a place for personal agenda, there's a place for self-aggrandizement. That place exists in Chinese society and in Chinese public culture, but that place is not the Chinese state, right? You cannot be in the Chinese state and act in a way that is antithetical to the goals of the Chinese Communist Party. If you do so, you stand to lose your life, quite literally. And I think the AES needs to, because at this point in time, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't expect to be hearing that a coup attempt was foiled at the point of execution, right? Obviously, we know that France and its partners will keep on cooking up these coup attempts indefinitely. We know that they're never going to stop. But at this point, what we should be hearing is that the coup attempt, while it was still in the process of planning, was taken apart, right? We shouldn't be hearing that at the point of execution, that if things had gone a certain way, maybe 2 or 3 hours later, we could have had a different result. We shouldn't be hearing that at this point in 2026, right? I think Ibrahim Traore should be more paranoid than most of us already are, and he should know that whether you call it a showing favor to loyalists, or you call it a purge, whatever fancy language you want to call it, the people who should have access to military power and state power of any description across Burkina Faso and across the AES are people whose loyalty and alignment is unquestionable. It's 100%. That is the only chance that the AES has of succeeding. If you still have, whenever someone is able to wave some $50,000 at them, then the whole thing is doomed, right? We need to be past that point now. So, it's just me talking on a live stream. It's not as if anyone is necessarily listening, but I really hope they understand what is at stake, and regardless of whatever NGO language one wants to use, that is dictatorial, is authoritarian, Africa's future, Africa's survival as a going concern rests on what the AES does or doesn't do over the coming half decade.
Speaking of that, I think yesterday also they have introduced the death penalty back to their law after how many years? I don't know. I don't know if it has to do perhaps to be used for those who have committed this attempted coup.
It should. It should. It absolutely should.
I'm going to dwell in AES again. I can't help but thinking again, I will join in what you said. It's not to advocate it or, to be pessimist about it. But if this thing happens, we know that the security system that we have in any given African country is not something that compete or counter what the imperialists have. So now Russia is an ally of these Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. But if that black winter comes or anything, we also have seen Russia withdrawing from Syria. So in terms of a prolonged or a permanent thing, what should this country do,
Um, are you asking what should the
Yeah,
AES countries do, or what should
yeah, yeah.
these foreign allies do?
Can they rely on Russia as their security ally? Because we have seen also Russia withdrawing from Syria, right?
Well, so I don't think the AES ever considered Russia to be their protector. I think they've always been very clear that you are your own protection, and your destiny ultimately lies on you, right? So Russia was always an alignment of what's the word I'm looking for, of pragmatism, right? It was the simple alignment of we need certain things that we do not have right now, and we need to get these things from wherever we can get them, from whoever is willing to partner with us to get these things right now. That partner happened to be Russia. It was always a thing of pragmatism. Their interests were aligned, right? In geopolitics, they're no friends. They're just allies. And allyship fundamentally is a temporal thing, right? There was a time in the 1930s, Russia and the US technically were allies. They fought on the same side of the Second World War, didn't they? Right. Nowadays, within less than a decade of the Second World War ending, the Cold War was already a thing. They were at each other's throats. So allyship is like that. So no one is suggesting, obviously, that Russia and the AES are someday going to become enemies or something. I don't think that's going to be the case. However, Russia was only ever, how do I put it now, a technical partner, right? Russia was there to provide hardware support, to provide training, to provide intelligence training to the AES, ultimately with the goal of helping them stand on their own 2 feet. The goal was never for Russia to replace their own homegrown capacity and for them to become dependent on Russia. Russia, as far as I'm aware, Russia doesn't even have that sort of foreign policy doctrine of going into countries and making them dependent on it, right? Because that is very much an imperialist way of doing things. And Russia, whether anybody wants to hear it or not, Russia is very much involved in an anti-imperial struggle of its own, right? So I don't think whether Russia is going to be the Superman that comes in and saves the day is something that Burkina Faso and its AES allies are losing sleep over, because that's not the role that Russia has ever played in the AES. The role that Russia has always played has been to provide specific types of support, and ultimately the backbone of everything that the AES has done has been the AES itself. Right? It's not Russia that has accomplished any of these things for the AES.
True.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be sustainable.
Yeah.
The AES has to do it itself, and based on all their, not just the speeches that they give, but the policy direction that you can clearly see, the government decisions that are made, the investments in industry and factories that are made, you can tell that these people have no intention of simply becoming a client state. Of Russia, right? Russia itself doesn't appear to want client states, and these people don't have any intention of becoming a Russian client state. What they want is to basically get it while the getting is good from Russia, which happens to be aligned with them at this point in time. For those who don't understand why Russia would be aligned with them, I think it's also important to explain that the conflict in Ukraine is directly linked to the conflict in the Sahel, right? Which is why Russia considers the Sahelian alliance to be something of a southern flank, right? So there's a Russian journalist who publishes on Substack that I follow. He's closely linked to the what's it called, the Kremlin, and in his he publishes regular updates on the war in Ukraine and other things, and he describes the Sahel as our southern flank. That's literally how they see it, right? And the reason they see the Sahel as the southern flank is that the relationship that Europe has with Africa is considered to be directly inimical to the interests of Russia. So that neo-colonial relationship that Europe has with Africa, where it extracts cheap resources from Africa, Russia considers that to be a threat to it for two main reasons. First of all, Russia considers that it should be the natural resource base of Europe. So when Europe wants natural gas or any of the multiple resources that are available in Russia, Russia should be Europe's default trading partner. That's how Russia sees it. Now, when Europe is able to get those things cheaply for next to nothing from Africa, that hits Russia in the pocket, first of all. Secondly, and more importantly, a lot of those resources are resources that are very useful to the military industrial complex. So if Europe is extracting cheap uranium and other things which can be used, lithium, and rare earth minerals, which are used in all sorts of military applications, and is extracting those things from Africa and potentially arming itself and building its military, who is that military going to be used on? It's Russia, obviously. And we're already seeing that where this proxy war in Ukraine, which is really a war between NATO and Russia, a lot of that, well, some of that supply chain that is feeding that war machine in Ukraine, that is a headache to Russia. A lot of that is built on African resources. So from Russia's point of view, it's beneficial for them to break that neo-colonial chain between Europe and Africa. And the way to break that chain is not necessarily to just come in and swing their guns around like they did in Afghanistan. They know that didn't work then, it's not going to work now. That the way to break that colonial chain is to assist African countries to develop the capacity to protect and defend themselves, and to develop the local industry to use their own resources such that they no longer give them away cheaply to Europe, which would then leave Europe basically dependent on Russia, which would guarantee a form of peace. That is what that alliance, what's it called? Fortunate sequence of events that led to the alliance between Sahel and Russia is about. Right? I feel like a lot of people do not understand this. So a lot of people think that, Russia is just another imperial power that just wants its own, the way the Europeans have been getting something out of Africa, the Russians also want their own. No, the Russians have plenty of resources. What they're looking for here is completely different, right? They consider Europe's relationship with Africa to be injurious to them. And fortunately for us, Europe's relationship with Africa, we also consider it injurious to us. So that alliance it's a very fortunate sequence of events that makes us very, very well aligned. But as with every alliance, it's subject to change. Everybody knows this. So the Sahelian nations are not stupid. They understand that they need to take all they can while they can get it, build all the capacity that they can build while the support and assistance is available, because tomorrow it could change. If and when it does change, nobody's going to begrudge Russia. Nobody's going to say Russia is terrible. That's just international relations. That's just geopolitics. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it will always be. It is what it is.
I must confess, I learned from this. I'm happy that you dived into it. Yeah. And I am very sure that a lot of people do not understand, because it's like a given. Okay, Russia has been a friend of Africa, and we think that it's, but it's good you enlighten us with that. And also, now when you explain, I also recalled when Captain Ibrahim Traore, when he was in Russia for the last time, was it in September, during this anniversary or commemoration of World War II, he visited this university in Russia, and it was a university that provides, or that basically, graduate students who works in
Sciences.
Science, military science, whatever, but with weapons and everything. So he was so enthusiastic to bring that kind of technology to Burkina Faso, not only to Burkina Faso, but he was also talking to make Burkina Faso a hub for that, to train African students from the region and also from the continent. And it's true. He understand. I was having this conversation prior I come to this interview with you, and also that person was telling me, I think Traore himself, Captain Traore, he understands that he is in this alone. Yeah, that's the way he sees it. In fact, he works, as I always say, like 24/7, as if his time is limited here. That's how I see it. Yeah. Now that brings us to the final question, I think. The silence of the African institutions or heads of states. In fact, in the face of now the abduction of President Maduro, African leaders and regional bodies have mostly remained silent. Now, is that caution, fear, or an admission of powerlessness? Like, what should African countries, especially those who opposed and targeted by the West, do to realistically protect themselves and countries against such intervention? To issue just a press statement was enough. What more should they do? Like, what should be strategically?
So if I were a security advisor at the AES, what I would do right now with all of this happening, I would probably stress test my own security architecture. I would maybe carry out a fake coup and see who fell in line with it, right? So this has been done in Nigeria in the 90s. General Abacha did something similar when he was trying to, what's the word? He was trying to solidify his stay in power. His head of security basically put out feelers within the military to see, who might be interested in joining an effort to overthrow this guy. And this whole thing was put together silently, and a few top generals, they expressed, tentative interest and whatnot. And at the end of it all, it turned out that it was orchestrated from the top. And those people basically got kicked out of the military. So maybe I'll be doing something similar right now, because again, what happened in Venezuela was not a triumph of the US military. So it was a triumph of US intelligence. Right? The US military did not go in guns a-blazing, defeat the whole country and cut off the head of state. That's not what happened. The US intelligence services were able to compromise the entire security architecture and get access to somebody they should not have had access to. That's what happened. So if I were in the intelligence infrastructure, whether in the AES or in any African country that has any real ambitions of sovereignty, I'll be looking to find out who is there within my architecture that presents this kind of risk to me. Someone or an institution that can be compromised potentially.
Should I go ahead entertain with what you just told us now? Perhaps it's a fake coup that we were told last night, that we have come across somehow.
I hope so. I certainly hope so. Yeah. I hope that's what it is. And if it is, then great job to them.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Okay. Then that leaves us, David. Thank you so much for your, for that clarity that you have brought to us. So tonight's conversation, it reminds us that global affairs are never distant. They shape African lives, African choices, and African futures in very real ways. So at Africa, here, our goal is not simply to report events, but to interrogate also power, question narratives, and center Africa in conversations that too often treat the continent as an afterthought. Whether it's Venezuela today, the Sahel tomorrow, or any African nation daring to assert its autonomy, these questions of sovereignty and justice concern us all. So, because understanding the world is not a luxury, it's a form of protection. Thank you again, David.